premature.
Yeah,
I think he very well might get there, but premature, which may sound there. I was their Man of the Year in 2003, I think it was, something like that. So I don't cast aspersions on my fellow awardees. I think there is great potential there. He just hasn't had time to exercise it yet. And but here's why I think it happened is that LGBT Roman Catholics have been in such a desert for so long. This feels like a drink of fresh water, and it tastes so good. And I also don't want to take away that jubilation, right?
Exactly. But the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and we will see what happens. I had occasion recently to write to Pope Francis because a delegation from the church which is involved in the Jubilee project happened to be in Rome, and they were going to see him, and they asked, can we hand him a letter from you? And so I wrote one, and in it I talked about the joy I feel that the Archdiocese of Los Angeles is reasonably friendly to me, and that when the Pope comes to the United States, I hoped he would come to our most diverse and dynamic great city, Los Angeles, and that he would meet with all of us. And I think there's a possibility that those things could happen. It's actually more likely that Pope Francis would publicly shake the hand of one of us than it has ever been in history. And that kind of gesture would be enormous. But it hasn't happened yet, and there are a lot of things that stand in the way.
Curtis has a brief, direct question.
Thank you. What do you think motivates the deep, kind of small meanness that comes from the religious right toward LGBT Americans? What is it that just motivates that just vile angriness and awfulness toward us?
Well, so the opposite of love is not hate but fear, right? And so my guess at that is that because Scripture appears to be clear about this issue, it is not, and taken in context, it doesn't say what we've been told it says, etc., but it appears to be very clear about this. And so if this falls, then that whole neat and tidy little construct falls. And if your entire worldview and your own way of being in the world hangs on that issue, then you're going to resist it with everything you can muster.
The issue being biblical inerrancy?
Right, exactly. Does the Bible mean what it says?
And behind that, Christianity has been subject for a long time to the temptation of zero-sum thinking, that it has to be one or the other. That if this is the body and the soul, God and the world, heaven and hell, all these binaries that have forced us into that kind of false logic. We live in a faith that is a both-and faith, that humans are capable of wonderful self-sacrifice and also extraordinary selfishness. God works through means that for us might even seem repugnant, that God is everywhere and in everything. But people, feel a need for clarity and certainty that tempts them, and I think this might be a form of our original sin, tempts them into this kind of binary thinking, where it has to be one thing or the other. There's no gray area in between. So we have both the scriptural tradition, but also a kind of a weakness in our own minds that leads us to want to make absolute pronouncements.
Let me just also say, around the issue of fear, that's really how I've navigated the last 11 and a half, 12 years, which is when someone comes at me with that kind of hate, what I try to do is to step back and say, what is this person afraid of? And is there anything I can say or do that might lessen their need to be fearful? That seems like a better way to engage our enemies than to just, we're going to get nowhere arguing Leviticus, right? I mean, that is a waste of time. But if I can do or say something that lessens their fear that their world is going to come apart if they were to change their mind slightly about that, then I will play a small and good part.
Chuck Colbert has a question.
First of all, thank you for bringing not only the Protestant but the English Reformation to the NLGJA. But my question is, with respect to the Catholic Church, how do you think the media could press the Pope and others in the disconnect between the language of don't judge with the fact that the catechism and the teaching of the Church is extremely judgmental, intrinsic evil, objective disorder, grave depravity, violence to children, the litany goes on and on, particularly in the context that there are so many gay priests and bishops. I mean, how can the media sort of crack open some of this, not to humiliate and embarrass, but to open up to get a real conversation about what's really going on in the Catholic Church, and I would argue in Christendom writ large.
I would say that an important thing, although difficult to communicate, is that the Pope is not the only Catholic. And if the press is much more successful at pointing out disparities and comparing things than it is in drawing conclusions, those will seem obvious and unfair to some. But if you could simply lift up the fact that the Pope is speaking for Catholicism at the same time the Church is doing things that contradict what the Pope is saying. Simply lay it out there. Don't stop with the Pope. That's I think the key thing. And if there's always a juxtaposition between the one and the other, people will get it.
Let me just make a comment about why I am less than optimistic about the Roman Catholic Church changing its stance on LGBT people. I believe, out of my own experience and just my reading of history, that the feminist movement in this country preceded the LGBT rights movement and had to. I can remember, long before I had actually come out, before I had reconciled myself to being gay, knowing somewhere deep in my heart that what women were doing in the women's movement was the key to my own liberation as a human being and then as a gay man. I led a retreat for 75 gay Roman Catholic priests a few years ago from all over the country. We had to give it a bogus name so that the archdiocese couldn't shut it down. And I mean, this was one of the funnest weeks I have ever spent in my whole life. And you have never seen anything until you've seen 75 gay Roman Catholic priests gathered around a piano singing, "How do you solve a problem like Maria?" And about half of them were out with their superiors, about half of them were not. And they wanted to know what they could do. And I said, you know, there are a lot of choices between where you are now and just being out there. And I said, I don't think the Roman Catholic Church is going to do anything about its gay problem until it does something about its woman problem. And so I encouraged them to go home and work for the ordination of women. And it's so bizarre because women are running most Roman Catholic parishes now, right? Because there's so few priests around. And I thought it was really interesting that this new Pope opened the door on the possibility of married priests before opening the door, which has not been opened at all, on the ordination of women. And I think it's just very significant that he would entertain the notion of letting male priests get married before he would ever entertain the notion of ordaining women. And once again, you've got this intersectionality, right? Between LGBT stuff and gender bias. Yeah.
Cindy? Yeah. From one Episcopalian to another, Bishop Robinson.
Go, girl.
I noticed you had mentioned what you seem to consider a overemphasis on unity in the Anglican Communion in terms of having treated the Lambeth Conference. And I know that your point to not only split the Anglican Communion, but even the American Episcopal Church in two. Do you think that sort of unity is really necessary? There are diverse voices within Christianity. Would it be all that bad if the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States just said bye?
You mean goodbye to the rest of the community?
Yes.
Oh yeah, I think it would be a terrible thing. I mean, there's so few places that actually can pull off genuine conversation and dialogue between people who differ. I think the worst sin today for churches is for anyone to leave the table. And this, by the way, this great schism that has been reported in the press about the Episcopal Church, can I just say that using their own numbers, without any question at all, they only claim about 100,000 people out of a denomination of over 2 million. So, yes, we perhaps divided into two, but not into two equal parts. And I think that's something the press has gotten wrong. Because if you ask most people, they think the Episcopal Church kind of split down the middle. It did not split down the middle. It split 95% and 5%.
I think that's very similar to the Lutheran Church.
Absolutely. And it is interesting that division is reported on much more intensely than the proportionality of it. We also, a new Lutheran Church has not emerged. It is a fringe Lutheran Church.
Jason is the word.
Yes, hi. Bishop Robinson alluded earlier to the potentiality of marriage equality being settled next year. What do you think the reaction would be from the folks on the small c conservative side of religion, or the religious right, in that type of ruling around the country?
I'm sorry, about marriage equality?
Right. What would be the reaction from conservatives?
Well, my sense is that most of the religious right thinks it's a done deal, and that they lost.
Which is perhaps why it's moving into religious exemption.
Well, so that was just going to be my follow-up comment, which is why I think we see all of this energy around so-called religious liberty. Because they think, they know that they've lost the... I mean, when Maggie Gallagher, for God's sake, of the National Organization for Marriage, so-called, says it's over and done, and let's learn to live as a small minority of the faithful, you know you've gotten somewhere. But then that is directly proportional to this rise in the push for religious exemptions from the anti-discrimination laws.
I think that's entirely true. I had a very intriguing visit in my office a couple of weeks ago from a very high-ranking Mormon official on the West Coast, who I will not mention, but who wanted to come and meet me and gave me a gift. And we sat and we talked in church hierarchy code very carefully about where we might work together. And it was clear to me that they were fishing for ways to talk about values we share without emphasizing the things that have divided us. And I thought, in some ways, it was brilliant. I wasn't being co-opted. They were feeling me out, and I was doing the same with them. But it was clear that they knew who I was. They knew that I stood for something they had spent a lot of energy and money opposing. And that they're willing in some way, at least one part of their church is willing in some way to think beyond that to what comes next, was a confusing sign of hope, I thought.
I'll tell you another highly unreported story, which is a new young generation of evangelicals, all of whom have LGBT friends. And they're just not willing to believe this stuff anymore that they're being told. And a lot of them are leaving those evangelical churches in which they grew up in great numbers. And the mega churches are in a panic over this. For the last 2 or 3 years, it's almost the entire conversation at their large gatherings around the country for leadership in these large megachurches. The hemorrhaging of members, but particularly young members, and it's over this LGBT issue. They are simply not willing to believe those things about their friends whom they know these things don't describe. And so I think that's a greatly underreported story. And the young evangelical theologians are doing the hard work of rethinking that. I was invited to Fuller Seminary, which is like they crank out more evangelical ministers than anywhere. They came to see the documentary film about me when it premiered at Sundance, and invited me to the seminary. I said, well, if you can get me an invitation, I'll come. I came, and there were over 200 students turned out, faculty, staff, and so on. Everyone entered the room certain what they believed about the LGBT issue, and many of them left confused, which is a huge step forward, right? Because many evangelicals don't want to even talk about this issue because there's nothing to talk about. It's clear what the right thing is. So I think that's a vastly underreported story on this new breed of evangelicals who are going to change those evangelical churches.
Yes, they are changing.
Well, we always like to end on a good news tip, so now we all have something to go back and prove to our editors that we did our job here to get people started. Bishop Robinson, Bishop Erwin, thank you so much for taking that kind of time.